I'm going to introduce briefly the defense, the event for the audience. We have like about 10 to 12 people here in addition to the community members. And then I'll introduce you and Dawn, and then I'll pass the word to our candidate.
All right.
Wonderful. So welcome everybody to the defense. This is the doctoral defense of Samuel Malkemus, whose title is Exploring the Flesh and Blood of Human Nature, an interdisciplinary inquiry into sexuality, instinct, and world. So thank you, Sam, for all your efforts to arriving here. And this is the structure of the defense will be quite a standard. You'll have about 45 minutes to 1 hour to present your work. And then each of the candidates, we're all candidates for something, right? Each of the committee members will have like some time to engage you, to appreciate your work, as well as to ask you a few questions or comment on the work, whatever. And then hopefully the audience will also have some time to engage you. At that time, Don and I will come out of the room, we'll call Maxine, and we'll come back with our final verdict. So, and the only thing I would like to say before moving into introductions is that, like all doctoral defenses, this is obviously a public event. And what this means is that it's also a participatory event. You are here as an audience, but all of you are also participating here with your presence in this rite of passage from Sam, and a rite of passage that many of you will go through quite soon. So I invite you during this time to be as present and mindful and accompany Sam through this threshold with as much mindfulness and presence as you are able at this time in the morning today. Get your coffees. So let me introduce the committee members. Let's start with our external member. And this is Maxine Sheets Johnston. She was a dancer and choreographer, a professor or dance scholar. She choreographed 25 dances, performed in 13 of these, and was the artistic director of 5 concerts. In her second and ongoing life, she's a philosopher affiliated with the Department of Philosophy at the University of Oregon, when she taught periodically in the 90s, and she's now holding an ongoing Curtis professor appointment. Her book publications include The Phenomenology of Dance, what she calls the Roots Trilogy, The Roots of Thinking, The Roots of Power, and The Roots of Morality. Another book is called Giving the Body Its Due. And then finally, a quite influential book called The Corporeal Turn, an interdisciplinary reader. She was awarded a Distinguished Fellowship in 2007 for her research on xenophobia at the Institute of Advanced Study of Durham University, UK. Maxine, would you like to add anything to the introduction?
No, that's just fine.
Thank you. And then Dawn Johnson, as usual, needs no introduction here at CIS, but let me just say that he's the founder of the Somatic Psychotherapy Program. It's the first of its kind in this country and in the world, very likely. And he's the author, editor of several books and articles on the role of transformative body practices and awareness in the shaping of a more human world, including Body, Spirit and Democracy, Body, Recovering Our Sensual Wisdom, The Body in Psychotherapy, and Bone, Breath and Gesture, Exploration in Somatic Psychotherapy. And my name is Jorge Ferrer, and
Hi, Maxine.
Oh, yes.
Sorry. Oh, hi, Maxine.
Hi.
And would you like to add anything
No.
to your introduction? So I'll just say my name is Jorge Ferrer. I teach in the US Psychology Department, and I teach classes on transpersonal psychology, comparative mysticism, theoretical research, and also more relevant for our purposes today, embodied spiritual inquiry. So I think that's all for introduction. So let's go to the most important part of this event, that is Sam's presentation. So Sam, whenever you're ready, the stage is yours.
So welcome everyone. And basically in this talk I'm going to give an overview of my dissertation, which is it's comprised of 3 articles. I've published 2 articles, and one I'm currently preparing for publication. So it's just going to be a very brief overview of those articles focusing a little bit on the dissertation itself. In part of the dissertation, I kind of interwove those into a coherent narrative. So introduction, methodology, and conclusion, and avenues for further inquiry, etc. So just to begin, I'm just going to invite you to become present where you are. If you'd like to close your eyes and just take a deeper breath, allowing yourself just to become more present, feeling the weight of your body. And in this process of becoming more present, I want to invite you, if you like, to just feel yourself, your identity as a sexual being. Also as an instinctual being with a particular evolutionary heritage. And also as a spiritual being. Your connection, a relationship to the mystery of existence. And when you like, you can open your eyes. And so before I move into the dissertation, I just want to mention a little bit of a personal nature of why I engaged. Why did I do such a thing as a dissertation and do all this work? So there's a number of things. The first thing, very simply, is a basic love of learning that I have. Fascination of learning. My first day at kindergarten, I didn't want to come home from school. I was crying and fighting. Here I am after more than 30 years in school, and I haven't stopped. So I just have that passion. Following that is a basic sense of wonder at the awe and mystery of existence, why we're here, how is it that we're living together in relationship. And following that, it's basically my own process of personal transformation, healing, and growth, of trying to come to terms with my own struggles as a man in this world, and in particular in relationship to this dissertation as a sexual and instinctual man, spiritual man. So with this struggle, basically a process of healing my own wounds, this dissertation is kind of my own, reflective of my own process of healing, to offer a contribution to a disassociated and largely devitalized culture, where I found myself trying to create something that I wish I would have had in relationship for my own process of growth. And so finally, my dissertation, as theoretical and philosophical as it is, and you'll see it is very theoretical, has very deep personal roots. So, I'm going to just do a little brief overview of the dissertation itself, starting with the thesis of the dissertation, which is: many previous attempts to understand human nature are limited insofar as they have neglected to include somatic dimensions of subjective experience. So this is the overarching narrative that I weave through the three articles. The objectives, sub-objectives of this thesis are: 1, to critique reductive presentations of human nature; 2, to give voice to the subjective dynamics of bodily life; and 3, to suggest the need for a somatically rooted epistemology that does not hold bodily wisdom as subordinate to mental or logical forms of knowing. So, in a basic sense, the role of experience, the role of the body, and trying to articulate vision that, in contrast to reductive presentations. Next, the method that I applied for this dissertation, these 3 separate articles. So there's this very general method, interdisciplinary theoretical approach that in a basic sense applies philosophical inquiry. In each article, I formulated a problem. There's a problem in sexology, the way sexuality is studied or approached, as in the first article. And then there's a response to that problem. Following that, this dissertation was approached hermeneutically. So not applied in the traditional sense of an exegesis, where texts are analyzed as in hermeneutics emerging from biblical studies, but as a theoretical perspective. So basically this theoretical perspective honors the reality of interpretation, that all engagement with scholarly activity is an act of interpretation. We're always interpreting, and there's a dynamic relationship between interpretation and understanding. And there's a co-creative relationship between myself as researcher and the texts and living energies that I'm drawing on to create my perspectives. So hermeneutics also, through Gadamer, is really acknowledging the historical community. So it's not me in a static relationship to what I'm engaging, but I'm creating an evolution of thought, evolution of vision, and really in relationship with a historical community of scholars, and the evolution of human culture at large. So, the last point on the method here is that I articulated 3 methodological lenses through which I approached kind of the dissertation as a whole. And so these are lenses that informed my basic philosophical vision of the world, and in relationship to these articles. The first is Husserl's phenomenology. And essentially, Husserl's articulation of transcendental phenomenology, his honoring of subjectivity and the constitutive nature of experience itself. So really a deep understanding of what it means to experience as a conscious being, versus a scientific colonization of thinking, what he calls the mathematicization, following Galileo, where everything becomes this mathematical manifold that can be measured and calculated in particular ways. Everything's objectively measured versus space for experience. The second point is Sheets Johnstone's corporeal turn. So basically acknowledging the constitutive wisdom of the body, the foundational role of the body in all of our theorizing and all of our actions and existing, versus the body as a secondary or subordinate, as she says, handmaiden to the all-powerful mind, the all-powerful sense of reason, and then there's the body. There's the mind and consciousness, and then there's the body. So the third perspective is Freire and Sherman's participatory turn, and in particular, their articulation of a multidimensional cognition. So a sense of cognition and understanding that is not relegated to the mind alone, brain-centered or cognicentric, but includes other forms of knowing, romantic heart, vital, sensual passion, the sensuous body, other forms of understanding. So inviting those other forms of understanding into the inquiry. So with that brief overview, I'm going to move into the first article. And this article I co-authored with Marina Romero, who's sitting here with us today, and we had it published in the International Journal of Transpersonal Studies. And just to go through it briefly, there are 3 main aims that we articulate at the beginning of the article. One is to contrast a holistic approach to sexuality versus contemporary approaches in sexology. And so look at that contrast. And I'm going to go through each of these aims in more detail. The second aim is then to present more deeply our expanded understanding of sexuality. What is sexuality from an expanded sense? And the third is to then articulate the possibility of using this expanded understanding of sexuality as a transformational path of healing and growth. So, to move in to the first aim here, there's two main problems that we articulate following Ferrer, Romero, and Albareda. In their article, there's the problem of cognicentrism, which I already mentioned in the first as one of my methodological lenses, but the mind being held as superior to embodied forms of knowing, other centers of energy. So basically, in order to support this problem and articulate it, we present our method that we use of holistic transformation. And in that method, articulate the somatically localized centers of energy that reflect distinct epistemic capacities. The heart center, the vital center, the body, consciousness, and mind being one member of a holistic team, not reduced or superior to other aspects. We then go into the problem of scientism in contemporary sexology. Basically, contemporary sexology is a social scientific understanding of sexuality. So you look at large statistical analysis of populations of different sexual behaviors, dispositions. And so you study contemporary sexuality, and you're going to be studying a lot of facts and a lot of data and a lot of statistical analysis. And we don't find fault with the value of these analyses, but we do find fault when this perspective is held in a rigid way and there's no room available for other perspectives. So we suggest that whatever methodology you're using to engage your research is going to influence the results you have. So you're going to apply the scientific method, you're going to have scientific data as a result. And we say there's room for more if you apply a different method. So we have our holistic method. And so this is the first point. The second point, we go into our expanded understanding of sexuality. So this is briefly understanding sexuality as life force energy. In the article, we articulate it as sexuality as life. So living, vital force of generativity that impels the manifestation of our life potentials and connects us to the cyclical rhythms of life itself. So a deeper and expanded understanding of sexuality as that force of energy that impels biotic existence, living being. Two transpersonal dimensions of that. The first is that this understanding of sexuality calls us to transcend unhealthy patterns. It's a deep voice of wisdom that each of us can connect to, suggest, and also as a guide to the essential. The essential being that which is aligned with the fullest flourishing of all of life, the fullest flourishing of our own life potentials and what it means to exist as a human being. The second sense that this understanding of sexuality is transpersonal is that it connects us to what we term dark energy, which is the creative energy of cosmic evolutionary process. So it's a energy of cosmic evolution that comes into our experience as human beings, impels us as living beings. It gives us a greater connection to cosmic evolution than a strict separation between living being and non-living being. Transpersonal dimension enters in. So this expanded understanding of sexuality is generally colonized by cultural traditions or developmental patterns. So it requires a process of healing to really have a sense of this in general. It requires a process of healing to have a sense of what would it really mean to live as a vitally alive human being. So this process of healing is related to the work and really the focus of the work that we do. And through it we propose this principle of holistic sexuality That is, that no aspect of our identity can manifest its full potential without welcoming, relating, and integrating the flow of sexual energy, clean, essential flow. So meaning any dimension of our existence, say our heart energies, our emotional sense, unless that aspect is vitalized and is connected to this life force energy, it might not be able to creatively manifest its energies. It won't be able to creatively manifest its energies. So, we have the third aim, which is articulating sexuality as a transformational path. And so, in order to do this, we articulate a distinction between sexuality as life versus being and acting sexual. Sexuality, as we normally understand it, sexual behaviors, desires, attractions, etc. And so we have this broader understanding and this more traditional understanding. And in these two paths, basically, the first path is, are you alive? Are you vitally alive human being? To what extent are you? To what extent are you not? And basically the methodology and the work that we do involves really deeply inquiring into that. You know, do you have a sense of sexuality as life? Do you have a relationship to its essence? And then the second transformational path related to that is your sexual behavior grounded in that vital aliveness? So looking at your sexual tendencies, your behaviors, and seeing how are they connected. Is your sexual identity mental construct that you've taken from somewhere, or is it really streaming from this fountainhead of sexual life energy? To end the article, we warn of the risks of these paths, that sexuality, life force energy is a formidable energy, as the energy that keeps us alive as human beings, and the tendency towards distortion, risks towards getting lost in grandiose fantasies, or following a pornographic industry. So we get into those things, we warn of the risks, and we suggest the potential of uniting the two paths. So meaning in your sexual behavior, calling in this life force energy, and suggesting that this is one of the most powerful ways to make you vitally alive as a human being, to connect to your creative alive potentials, and to manifest the fullest flourishing of your existence. So, those are our three aims that we went through, and we will just move into the next article. Moving right along. So the second article is an article that I'm still working towards publication. It's been accepted with revisions to the Journal of Humanistic Psychology, just as of last week or so. And so it's the freshest one here. Its aim is to critique a narrow understanding of instinct. So the traditional understanding of instinct that has emerged out of ethology, the study of animal behavior, as a fixed action pattern. And there's a lot of problems with this understanding as a result of genetic and biological determinism that is carried forward in that understanding of instinct. I'm going to go through these aims in more detail once more. The second, then, is to present an expanded concept of instinct. A concept that includes subjectivity, includes experience, includes awareness of bodily consciousness. Also, through that, a holistic account of evolution, genetics, and physiological processes. And then at the end of the article, opening towards an instinctual psychology. The original intention of the article was to create an instinctual psychology, but there was so much confusion around what is instinct that the article ended up going more focused into what is instinct at all anyway. So, moving into the first aim, what I do in the paper is look at the history of the concept of instinct to understand from where the theory emerged, what are its roots, really, it emerged in, theology through Aquinas, a distinction between animals and human beings, or animals and man. Animals have instincts, humans do not. They are reasonable beings. And there's this distinction. And it really, it wasn't until Darwin that the concept of instinct became popularized. There's many theorists before Darwin that wrote of instinct in different ways, through Hobbes and other precursors. And then Freud and psychoanalysis really taking Darwin's insights forward towards a psychology of instinct. So what I do is I look at early instinctual theorists, because basically right now the concept of instinct outside of depth psychology doesn't exist in contemporary psychology. It's an animal term. There's no human instinct. So why is that? And in the 1880s, the turn of the century there to the 1920s, it was like the main thing. Everyone was publishing books on instinct. Everyone wanted to know what was instinct. How do we understand human beings through instinct? And I found that out, and it was like, wow, this is exciting. Look at all these great publications on instinct that are way hidden somewhere. So, William James, well-known, philosopher, psychologist here in America, and then also particularly in England and Ireland with Hobhouse, Morgan, and these guys. So what I did is I looked at them all, not all of them, but these central theorists were the main proponents of instinct, and said, well, what was their definition of it? And basically, in a simple way, instinct has these four characteristics of their theorizing. It's innate versus learned, something that comes with our evolution. There's a plurality of types of instincts. There's the aggressive instinct, the affective instinct, and the lists go on. I'll get into that. There's a physiological basis for instinctual behavior, and there's a cognitive affective dimension, meaning through experience there's something that impels you towards a particular end. Cognitive, popularized from Spinoza, coming basically through this desire, this impulse, this urge towards relationship. And affective basically being there's an emotional affective component to this. There's an emotional energy through fear or anger or positive regard. So instinct, coming from the Latin instinctus, meaning impulse, which is derived from the Latin instigere, literally to prick from within. So this inner pricking, this inner impulse. So how? So they had all this great stuff, but each one of them had a different theory. One person was saying this, one person was saying this. There was all these kind of confusions. Nothing was very clear, and they were having all these great debates about it until the death of instinct, which is a term by Ronald Fletcher in his book Instinct in Man from 1957. But basically Dunlap, one of the first behaviorists, psychological behaviorists, published this article, Are There Any Instincts? 1919. He says no, it's all a fallacy, there are no instincts, there are only neurological units of organization that can be passed on hereditarily. There's no such thing as instinctual experience, it's all just inner neuronal structure. Then the behaviorists came along, Watson, Kuo, and they basically created this whole psychology of behaviorism that dominated American psychology for the next, through Skinner, for the next 60 years. And they're basically like there's no innate behavior. Everything is learned, everything is conditioned, everything is, no innate behavior. And then Bernard has a very thorough critique of instinct in many ways. So we'll get into this critique a little bit. So basically what I do is I go, well, why did it die? Is their critique valid? To what extent is it valid? To what extent is it not? And so I kind of critique the critique of the critics and also critique the original presentation, and it's kind of complicated, but basically, the original psychologists and the critics were trying to present simplistic answers to complex issues, and they would fall into the problems of dualism, reductionism, and scientism. And so I state the case that the death of instinct is not justified, but a more nuanced and complex understanding reveals a very robust account of instinct. So these main points that I present, I look at nature and nurture to look at innate. There's this conflation between everything's innate or everything's learned, or everything's innate, everything's learned. And so I analyze that dualism and say, well, things are innate and learned, and it's a complex, symbiotic relationship that's interwoven between the two. And there's many more details there. The particular theory of genetics, for instance, which I won't go into too much, but basically Darwin originally proposed that there was some kind of invisible substance that was passed on that he called invisible characters, or gemuls, that later became the term genes, that were somehow passed through. So there became this division between inner, innate structures and outer. And anyway, it's a whole discussion on genetics that I won't get into. But simple understanding is that there's a nurturing of nature, and they don't need to be antagonistic. The second is the classification of instincts. It's found that it was really problematic because it's founded on the nature-nurture dualism. So some of the early instinct theorists were saying, well, these are all instincts. I have 108 instincts. And then the other guy says, no, there's 17 instincts. And the other guy says, no, there's 32. They're saying, well, what's innate and what's learned? And they don't really have a way to distinguish between the two. Physiologically determined. The critics say there is no instinct, there is no need for looking at experience. All there is, if there is an instinct, is just physiological mechanisms that maybe do something, but we don't really know what they are, so we don't need the concept at all. So in that sense, there's this real confusion between subjectivity versus objectivity. There's like an antagonism between what it means to be an experiencing, existing being, and what it means to be a being that can be measured and calculated and analyzed and examined in a particular way. I have a quote here, actually from Maxine, that speaks nicely to this physiological determination. That is, in relationship to the phenomenological distinction between what it means to the physical body that you can measure and the lived body that you live. There's always this dualism. So she suggests there needs not be this dualism at all. But she says the physical and lived are not two distinct evolutionary sequences meeting and happening in the same creature. What exists and evolves are not parts but wholes, not fragments of life, but life itself. So it's a whole. We're simultaneously a physical organism and an experiencing organism. So she says, what is lived then is an existential evolutionary sense, in an existential evolutionary sense, are different sensory kinetic worlds. They bespeak certain sensory kinetic powers and sensitivities. So as particular organisms, we have particular sensitivities and particular worlds of experience that we're constituting and in relationship with. The fourth point, cognitive affective motivations. The critics just deny that because that's related to experience, and they actually say there's no need to look at experience at all. So I give examples, different classic examples and some contemporary, of accounts of where cognitive affective motivations are important. Hans Jonas, his account of life is essentially self-transcending. That is, any organic entity is always moving beyond itself into relationship with the world. Goldstein, all living beings have a drive towards self-actualization. They're driven towards actualizing the potentials that they have at their disposal. And then also Freud's basic instinctual psychology, that there's different impulses and drives that impel us to act in certain ways, often separate from our own conscious intentions and awareness. So, I then moved towards reclaiming instinct. Okay, we've gone through this critique and analysis and all these kind of confusing things, and just briefly, the history does continue. So, concept of instinct dies to some extent, but then in the 1930s and really popularized in the 1950s, the concept emerges in ethology with Conrad Lawrence's account of instinctual imprinting. In particular, you may have seen images of him, Conrad Lawrence, or the gray-lag goose. You know, when it's a little goose, there's a critical moment that if there's any kind of figure, living being, even doesn't have to be living, that somehow resembles the mother or not at all, like Conrad's boots. In that moment, the goose becomes attached to that object. So there's all these images of him trouncing through the forest with his boots and a whole line of geese following him. And so he says, look, instinct is real and we can't forget instinct. But his whole approach, he was a really clever, beautiful man and love of animals and all these things, but he had a very mechanistic and reductive approach to instinct. So there was like internal mechanisms and gears that kind of built up pressure and tension and did all this kind of thing, like the human machine created these things. So it was perfectly in line with behaviorism, so it was very lauded, you know, as a beautiful thing. Like, he's so brilliant, he got a Nobel Prize, and instinct became popular. Then the human genome, DNA, and they're like, wow, innate factors really play a large role, you know, and instinct becomes popular again, but still with this reductive history. Evolutionary psychology is an example of continuing this reductive history in terms of not making space for human experience, or for even animal experience to some extent. It's another reductive thing. So I try to move towards, what about the possibility of humanistic depth, transpersonal psychological accounts of instinct? So, what I do when I start this is I look at baby sea turtles, and try to articulate their instinctual behavior. Look at the classical account versus my expanded approach. And basically, let's see how we're doing on time here, but yeah, so the traditional account, well, just the mother climbs up the beach at a certain point, the warmest month of the year, digs a hole with her fins, lays about 50 to 200 eggs, covers up the hole, and she just goes out to sea. So these eggs are there, you know, a few hundred eggs, and over 7 days they hatch. And they hatch, once they've all hatched, they wait for each other. Once they're all there together, then little by little they start digging a little hole, coming out, and then they all come out down to sea, usually at night. And the question, the simple instinctual question is, how do they know which direction to go? How do they know how to go down to sea? How do they know anything at all? They're just born, they're just in the sand, little silly guys. But, so there's a number of factors. The traditional account is there's an internal genetic physiological mechanism that somehow comes on, and they're like triggered, and they're like, oh, let's go down to the sea. Kind of automaton to some extent. A more modern account involves recognizing the phototrophic nature of sea turtles, that they have a sensitivity to light, that the light on the ocean's horizon is the brightest light source, so they kind of move down towards the light. So that's really the determining factor. But in contemporary instinctual theory and accounts, that is the sole factor, and it's like reduced to that, and there's not taking into account the awareness that sea turtles are of the sea, that they're developed and evolved over millions of years to metabolize salt water, to swim, to connect to the magnetic, you know, currents of the earth and return to home and do all these amazing things. So I basically point that out and talk a little bit about kind of the majesty of, you know, trillions of different cells combining to form a particular awareness that your awareness is merging out of these cellular intelligences. You know, the fact that you have fins, these particular senses and identities, in a world of significance is born, a sea turtle world in this case. So I propose the term that a phylogenetic resonance for instinct, that instinctual behavior involves a process where this resonance emerges that has been carried with you through cellular evolution. And this phylogenetic resonance is the process through which evolutionary developed cellular intelligences inform the whole body awareness of a given organism. So there's a much deeper wisdom at play. The ocular nerves and the phototraffic, the sensitivity to light is an important factor, but it's not the factor. So, let's see, we gotta move forward here. Going backwards. Okay. So then I propose a broad understanding of instinct that's reflective of all life, a fundamental dimension of what it means to exist as a living being. We're instinctual beings at all moments, at all times. Right now, instinct is present through you, through your phylogenetic unfolding of your existence. I then qualify this broad account to speak about the degree to which a phylogenetic resonance is corporally present. So there's an instinctual core that then is modulated by conditioning, social norms, restrained by social norms. I give examples of wolves or great white sharks. For instance, if a large winged gremlin were to fly into this room, we would all jump back and we'd have that core ready. You know, even though you're all very nicely sitting in your chairs right now and attentively listening to me in a very peaceful way, you have a potential to engage these impulses. So I also make the case that instinct is a crucial factor in terms of reflecting the organism's vitality and health, that these norms and conditions can only regulate instinct to a certain extent before the health of the organism begins to deteriorate, calcify, dry out, and die. The example is the great white shark. It has yet to be able to be held in captivity without its death, because it has this huge instinctual breath of crossing the oceans and being a massive instinctual being. And so that there's this really important piece for me in terms of what does it mean to be healthy as a human being? What does it mean to be healthy as an organism in general? And is our culture aligned with our instinctual health? So that's the last slide. I then expand further towards the possibility of an instinctual psychology and accounts of human instinct, relationship between instinct and culture, consciousness, healing. So this whole article is just this piece of articulating instinct in a general sense. And there's future projects that are already in the works to carry it forward. So, with that, we're going to move into the next article. So we have, I'm going to just recover this article briefly because there's a lot of material in it. It's towards a general theory of enaction, biological, transpersonal, and phenomenological dimensions. This was published in the Journal of Transpersonal Psychology. So the main aim of this article is to explore a general theory of enaction that integrates the biological and spiritual dimensions of experience and root those dimensions in bodily life, bodily consciousness, the unfolding of consciousness. So to do that, I look at these three approaches: the enactive approach of cognitive science, participatory approach of transpersonal studies, and the transcendental phenomenology of Edmund Husserl. So I'm going to go just briefly into each of those three approaches. Enaction, so here's the enactive approach, emerged from this poem by Antonio Machado. Caminante son tus vuelos el camino y nada más. No hay camino, se hace camino al andar. Wanderer, the road is your footsteps, nothing else. There is no road. You lay it down in walking. So that the road emerges as you walk. As you engage, the road is born. So in this sense of enaction, it's a new approach in cognitive science that involves not enaction in the sense of just acting, but in the sense of constituting the world constitution. Not in the sense of world as in the earth, but in the sense of the world of experience. Consciousness unfolding and being modulated as we live. As we live. We have a particular world, other organisms have a particular world. So this approach is contrasted to two other approaches in cognitive science, and then I go through these 3 points in the article. Autopoiesis, these points are foundational for the enactive approach. So autopoiesis is a theory of life, the way in which auto, self, poiesis producing organisms are self-producing entities. So we're constantly producing ourselves, metabolizing, basically, taking in thermodynamic exchange, food from the environment, we continue surviving, but we are self-producing. Down to a basic cell is a self-producing entity. So it's characteristic and a requirement for what it means to live as an organism. Then, as I said, a little bit of world constitution. There's this concept of world through the enactive approach. It co-emerges with self. When any entity arises into existence, there's a self and there's a world and there's a relationship. In this particular context, I use von Uxel's concept of Umwelt, which is environment, or biological world, the biological world of the organism. So human beings have a particular biological world, just as a cypress tree has a particular biological world. And then their account of cognition, that there is no separation between life and mind. Where there is living, there is cognition. So any organism displays a particular intelligence, down to the tiniest bacteria. It's using its flagella to go towards a food source. There's intelligence throughout all of life. In this term, sense-making, Varela. So, that's an action, and then we'll go to participation. We're almost through. And participation is Jorge's expansion of the enactive approach to articulate the emergence of ontologically rich spiritual worlds. It's the way in which spiritual worlds are born into being, are constituted. So he presents I use his vision of human participation, so articulate a relational, co-creative communion with the generative force of life and spirit, and or spirits. We're always embedded in this spiritual reality. And from this sense, you can have a sense of the biological worlds being simultaneously spiritual worlds. Jorge's articulation is in the context of religious studies and transpersonal studies. So particularly looking at traditions, how these worlds emerge. I go through his book, Revisioning Transpersonal Theory, 2002, his critiques of these 3 problematic presuppositions in transpersonal studies, to then arrive at his concept of participatory enaction, which is where ontologically rich, meaning real, existent worlds are brought into being. And so, for instance, in the context, for instance, of a Benedictine monk has a particular spiritual world that's being developed in relationship to particular saints, particular angels, particular energies, and there might be a really deep relationship that monk would have to that world, whereas someone from another tradition would have a very different world in which they're dwelling. So Jorge's looking at, well, what are the relationship between those worlds, and how are they constituted? So he proposes these terms: intentional and spontaneous co-creative participation, just in a simple sense of there can be an intentional relationship to a spiritual path, like I'm going to become, a Chan Buddhist, and I'm going to meditate in a particular way, and, let go of my thoughts and connect just to my breath, and it's going to develop intentionally a particular rich spiritual world that I can connect to in my experience. There's also the spontaneous emergence of worlds through mystical breakthroughs or non-altered states of consciousness or dreams or a particular opening to a world that emerges without your conscious intent, and so the relationship to that world. So, it's participation briefly, and then we have phenomenology. And so I was drawn to phenomenology because I saw the similarities between enaction and participation, and I felt phenomenology was a really powerful way to just really ground these grand accounts in experience and what it means to live as a conscious being and experiencing being. So in the first sense, in a basic sense of just lived experience, what it means to experience these worlds. And then the role of subjectivity, so a general sense of phenomenological psychology, and then the second sense of transcendental phenomenology or transcendental subjectivity, which is an examination, of the constitution of experience itself. So how is it that we're experiencing? So Husserl developed a detailed phenomenological method to scientifically and scrutinize, analyze what it means for consciousness to unfold. What are the structures of consciousness? What does it mean for that to be constituted? So, I draw on, I don't apply his method, but I just draw on the concepts that emerged through the application of his method, which is the life world, which is this dynamic, vague world of experience. So the life world, what it means to be a living being, just in general. So it's a much broader sense than a particular biological or spiritual, but it's the world of experience itself, the vague world, what it means to be an experiencing being. And it's always rooted, for Husserl, in a functioning body. There's always a body because he's analyzing experience as it's experienced. So it's related to a body. And then the concept of constitution, which relates to the dynamic process through which consciousness unfolds, and an attempt to describe that process. Part of that process involves this relationship between subjectivity, intersubjectivity, and world. Anyway, I get to this concept at the end here of transcendental inaction. Inaction, just in the general sense, world constitution through the phenomenological perspective, which is a deep understanding of experience. So, I then move towards a general theory of inaction, and I've examined these three modes of world constitution: biological, participatory, and transcendental. And then I articulate this kind of broad sense, and I use the metaphor of a fountain. And the metaphor of this continuous unfolding of consciousness, pulsing with moral life, born from the mystery of being, a matrix of interpenetrating relationships. So a general sense of what it means to be an existing being where these spiritual, biological dimensions are intertwined. And then I move from the particular to the planetary, and suggest possibilities of a living planetary system, dynamically evolving through time, embedded within an ever-shifting matrix of spiritual worlds, one stream within the immense flow of interpenetrating realities. One stream meaning we as one stream of experience through this nuanced, interlaced relationship of a vast matrix of worlds intertwining to constitute a large, massive fountain, the fountainhead, the all-flow of world consciousness. So that's what I arrived to at the end. And so it's an exploratory project. It's perhaps a little more creative and expansive in some ways than the other. It's also a lot of material I try to pack in. It's the first article that I worked on, and there's many avenues for further inquiry, there are many potentials for that. So, to move towards the conclusion, I just want to name the limitations very briefly. One was the process of the limitations of the dissertation. One was the multi-paper format itself. So versus a traditional dissertation, I have these 3 articles. They're restrained by the requirements of the journal. They can only have so many pages. They have to be precise and articulate in certain ways, and didn't allow me to go deeper into one subject, and expand more and have like no page restriction and just go wild or something. So it also has its fruits as well. The other limitation, just in general, there's a number. I chose these to focus on. Lack of experiential description. I would have liked more time to describe in more detail the nature of these experiences, give more concrete examples. And then in the Article 1, I was working with Jorge a little bit around the limitation of the essentialism that's there, potentially, and how to deal with that in terms of we're articulating the essential nature of sexuality from our perspective. And so who are we to articulate the essential nature, and is that really justified? And so we try to clarify the essential versus the inessential, meaning the essential, that which is aligned with our fullest flourishing, our creative potentials, that which is healthy for human existence and that which is not. And there can be perhaps some way to qualify that a little more and make it more aligned, so it's better. Anyway, the second, and then the Article 3, I was in dialogue with Maxine about this, is that my writing about Husserl is mainly drawn, I use a secondary source, so a prominent scholar, contemporary scholar of Husserl, I draw from his writings versus drawing from the writings of Husserl himself. And so that's a potential strong scholarly drawback. And I chose that decision because I actually had some Husserl quotes in there originally, and the reviewers were like, wow, these quotes are pretty wild. How does it fit in here? And so I had trouble finding ways to qualify, and it's reflective of my own continued development too, of my thinking. So, finally here, avenues for further research, more articles on the way. I'm working on some on instinct, one on Freud, human psychology, sexuality articles. Marina and I are working on another one, and I have one I'm working on, some more projects. And then, just for fun, in the dissertation, I propose a possibility of an integration. It's not the aim of the dissertation at all, but the 3 articles, they have some resonances, similarities. In a simple way, so if we think of sexuality as creative life force energy related to this cosmic evolution, and instinct as the behavioral manifestation of that energy, the way in which that energy gives rise to particular behaviors, then there's a way in which this dynamic impels the constitution of particular worlds. So, life force energy impelling action through the temporal unfolding of consciousness, simultaneously constituting worlds of existential significance. So, just to close, I just want to read this final reflection here on my dissertation. And so this dissertation has explored 3 somatically rooted dimensions of human nature. Its aims have been to provide expanded concepts of these dimensions in response to reductive and constricted presentations for the creative flourishing of all of life. These expanded concepts have been primarily focused upon including the subjective dynamics of bodily life. I have argued that the exclusion of lived experience leads to theory that is conceptually arid and ultimately inadequate. Thus, my inquiry has been guided by a fundamental concern with critiquing the reductive aspects of those disciplines that pertain directly to sexuality, instinct, and world constitution. This inquiry has also been guided by the broader aim of participating in the transformation of an American society that is largely sexually repressed, instinctually conflicted, and spiritually deprived. The puritanical roots of American culture continue to foster disassociated relations to both the human body and the body of earth from which animate being has emerged and evolved. In this way, I have attempted to participate in a restoration of bodily life, in renewing our connection to our sexual, instinctual, and world-constituting natures. I have hoped to support this restoration, and in so doing, I have gained a deeper appreciation for the richness of human nature and the nature of all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sam, for this great presentation, and we're going to proceed with comments and questions from your committee members. And usually I always invite our external member to go first, then second, and I'll go last. So
And then there'll be time for...
And hopefully, hopefully there will be time for the audience, of course. And at that time we may need to leave to talk among us, but hopefully we'll be here at least for some minutes of that engagement. Let's see how we go. So, Maxine, whenever you are ready, you can engage the candidate.
All right, that's just fine. I think your dissertation has really grandiose kinds of possibilities, and I think you have realized them in very basic ways. And as we have communicated back and forth, I think those ways can be also improved in so that they include more methodologically enlightened, paths for you to follow. But what I want to say first is that I really do think that your dissertation, in its mode of presentation and all by way of 3 articles, 2 of which have been published and one is apparently waiting for a publication, that your mode of presentation is both innovative and pragmatic. Pragmatic in the sense that it's, I think, a very good way for doctoral students to begin carving a path for themselves toward the future by actually writing articles, even if writing articles, as you say at the end here in your presentation, limits you in the way that you can explore a particular subject because of the nature of the journals to which you're submitting an article. But I think that you've done really well in terms of putting together these 3 somatically rooted dimensions of human nature as you define them. I think your critique of present-day investigations of sexuality and of instinct are particularly fine. I, as you know, am very concerned about methodology. So I'm going to just very briefly ask you a couple of questions about methodology. One is what exactly you mean by hermeneutical, because you say that, of course, in an exegetical sense, hermeneutical pertains to the text of others and the challenge of interpreting those texts. But you also seem to suggest that what you're doing is applying a hermeneutics to your own, what you call, intuitions. And I want to ask you how that works as hermeneutical.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. I struggled with that too, because at first, I think in my dissertation or in my proposal, there was a sense in which I articulated the application of hermeneutics. And now I'm trying to make the distinction between utilizing hermeneutic theory as an approach through which I'm engaging my inquiry, rather than a systematic application. And so my understanding in that sense, it's not in it's not a method that I'm systematically applying or really applying, but it's a method that is informing, and it's a perspective that's informing my engagement with the work. So basically what I'm trying to do is say, rather than engaging my dissertation or my articles from an uninformed perspective or a natural attitude in a basic sense, I'm trying to remain critically aware of the dynamics of interpretation and the basic hermeneutic theory from which I'm acquainted, being aware of the historical relationships, the relationship between myself and the text. But I think it's a tricky distinction, and I think it's a good point that you're bringing up too. So.
Yeah, well, it's not a matter of the text, because, for example, you talk about, I think it's on page 6, you say something about you're going to rationally articulate your intuitions in response to a problem. This is in terms of, you're talking about a hermeneutical approach. I'm asking you specifically about hermeneutics in relation to articulating your own intuitions. What's hermeneutic about that? How is that hermeneutical?
Yeah, well, that is not hermeneutical.
Right. I think I very much agree with you. That's not hermeneutical.
Yeah.
I think that examining your method in terms of your intuitions, what you call your intuitions in the context of your dissertation, would be a very good thing to do. Let me just follow up, because I don't want to take a lot of time, and I do have a couple of questions that have to do mostly with methodology. The second question is in terms of, because there are several errors about phenomenology in the dissertation. One of them that's particularly significant is that you connect the doing of phenomenology with a particular bodily identity, in other words, with what you yourself are experiencing. And you just miss completely the eidetic thrust of phenomenology. And that has to do, that ties up very much with your wanting to get to the essential nature of X, whatever X is, whether it's instinct or whether it's sexology or sexuality or whatever. I just want to mention this because any person who studies Husserl will tell you that to really understand Husserlian methodology and what Husserl is writing about in terms of phenomenology, and the name of phenomenology takes a good many years to digest, and you can go back over and over and over again and discover new things over the course of years. So it's not something that you can pick up immediately and just zip through. If you want to keep in touch with me about this, about some kind of path to follow, if you can't find somebody at some university close by to you where actual course in phenomenology is given that focuses on Husserl, I'd be glad to be in touch with you briefly about this. But there's a distinction to be made between what I experience in my own lived experience and doing a phenomenology of that kind of experience that gets you to the essential features of it. Do you understand what I'm saying?
No, I do. No, I really appreciate this distinction that you brought up, when you gave me my feedback, and I've been digesting it too, and in this presentation I tried to make the distinction more clear between a general phenomenological psychology of subjectivity or of experience in a more general sense, and Husserl's transcendental subjectivity, transcendental phenomenology. And so I agree with you, especially, in that third article, there was really my own struggle, and there was a big conflation between subjectivity and transcendental subjectivity, and maybe wasn't clearly distinguished. And so, I really appreciate your comments, and I'm taking them to heart, and I appreciate your offer too to potentially work with you more, in a brief way in the future, to continue to grow and cultivate my knowledge and relationship with Husserl in a more accurate and refined way that reflects his thinking.
And long years of study.
Yeah, long years.
The other thing, there are just two other brief comments that I'll make. One is that I think I would follow up very much on, I think it was Don who commented that you wrote saying that he suggested that you would do well to offer more descriptions. That's one of the things that is basic to phenomenology, is the ability to describe experience and describe it in a way that is true to the truths of experience. And there's good reason to think of description both in terms of linking what you do with science as well as with philosophy or with phenomenology in particular, because all science also starts with, if you look at Darwin's writings, for example, they are all descriptive of the life that he observed and that he documented descriptively at length. And that's always a good place to start before you go off theoretically, because it anchors your work in real life, real time terms. And so that's one comment. If you have anything that you want to add to that.
No, nothing to add. I'm of agreement. It's a evolving relationship too, and
The other second comment that I would say in any way to encourage you is to disconnect inaction from phenomenology. I don't think that you will really find a compatibility there between the two, because they're running on different paths. If you talk about sensory motor patterns, for example, you're not talking about lived experience. Sensory motor patterns have to do with neurological systems. They have to do with the present infatuation with the brain. I mean, in today's scientific, neuroscientific, cognitive science world. And you don't get down to what I have termed sensory kinetic realities. They're not sensory motor. We're not in touch with motors any more than we experience our brains. Although people in present-day science very commonly give experiential ascriptions to brains. Anyway, I don't think that there's a real compatibility there. Perhaps you will find one, but it needs to be really spelled out in quite concrete ways, I think, that show there a very distinctive relationship.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. I will contemplate it, and I definitely, after your initial comments, I looked back to my inaction article and could see in particular ways that were very problematic. And so I have engaged editing that to some extent, just for my own peace of mind, to be in harmony with my own sense of value. But I feel that your point is well taken. So I will continue to consider it and try to make more clear distinctions and really be careful about that kind of relationship between phenomenology and the enactive approach.
So I think that would be very wise, and you may see things differently in the end than I do, but I think that it's very wise to explore further. But the main point is, I would just say method. You know how people say the economy, the economy, the economy. I would just say methodology, methodology, methodology. So, a good round of applause to you, Samuel. I think you've done really quite a courageous and challenging piece of work.
Thank you so much, Maxine.
Thank you, Maxine. So I'd like to invite second member, Don Jensen.
So we're going to have a lunch in the next few days because I have about 50 things to talk to you about. But right now I'm going to just talk about two, mostly building on Maxine because I very much share Maxine's basic comments and thrust. So about Husserl. I think what needs to be spelled out much more clearly is, in terms of methodology, is the very challenge that Husserl set out, kind of the core, which I think is not fully driven home by you, which is he wanted to bring subjectivity into the realm of science. So he wanted to work out a methodology where subjectivity got out of the Cartesian realm, being shoveled up to its side as a secondary quality outside the realm of science, into science. So all of the strategies that he brought up, of reductionism and reduction and bracketing, and the various moves he made to establish a critical science of subjectivity that met the Cartesian need for how do we come to some agreement, public agreement, independent of dogma. It seems really crucial to me in the project. And in the several places where you talk about Husserl's genius, you're more talking about how he illuminates experience, but poets illuminate experience. You illuminate experience, fine a lot. And any scientist would say, oh yeah, that's beautiful. But the question is, how does it impact the scientific control of the world? And that was, when Husserl writes The Crisis, he says the big crisis is due to the fact that empirical science has taken over, and the sciences that come out of subjectivity have lost the battle. So I just want to underline what Maxine says, method, that the uniqueness is how to reshape the scientific mentality. Do you want to comment on that before I go to my second?
Yeah, I mean, my response is similar to Maxine's.
Because I think you know that.
Yeah.
It's just that in the articles, and I think probably it's
It's
part
a
of the
little
periodicals. The periodicals are not terribly interested in
Yeah.
all the intricacies of Husserl. So.
Yeah, so it gets a little muddled.
Yeah.
And, Maxine, she was originally commenting, and you too, to what extent there's poetry, and then there's phenomenology,
right.
and, what's the distinction?
And Merleau-Ponty kind of glides in between.
Yeah.
So.
Okay.
And just a little word about hermeneutics to also follow up on Maxine before I go into the second part about Husserl. Hermeneutics very much involves these issues that both Maxine and Jorge brought up about your sexuality piece. The interpretation has to include a really critical understanding of the interpreter's own historical and linguistic and gender and cultural framework that's both produced the texts and the interpretations, and that's reinterpreted by others. So those questions that both Maxine and Jorge raised about the sexuality article, it seems to be part of what a full-blown hermeneutic study would involve, really looking at Sonoma County. So the last thing I just wanted to say, because it seems so it's one of the parts of Husserl that really inspires me, and it seems very much in line with your thinking. I think it's in Ideas too, maybe Maxine remembers, where Husserl talks about where is the core experience of the self in terms of transcendental subjectivity. He articulates it in terms of this kind of raw sense of I can. This kind of raw sense of I can. It could take many strains. And our friend Elizabeth Benke wrote that really powerful piece about how this illuminates the horror of torture and child abuse, where that very radical sense of subjectivity is kind of directly tapped, so that the I can is hit at the very center before it can even begin to emerge from its movements. So I think those analyses of Husserl's about the radical experience of I can are really fit into your analysis of instinct in relation to microbiology and the sense of neurological patterns. Since I have time, I'm going to say one more. Do you want to say anything about that?
No, I have other aspirations towards that, little by little. So.
I just want to say a personal intellectual history part. I want to defend my old friend Thomas Aquinas. My first article was a result of a really weird stage of my life journey where I spent 3 months reading Thomas Aquinas because I had a question about, I thought he was not satisfied with rationalism. So I read his entire works in Latin in 3 months, and I published my first article with 200 Latin footnotes. Finding out, to my shock, that as you read through all these things, he grounds rationality on these deep appetites for truth and love. It's extraordinary texts, big texts, many of them, but there they are. Before Spinoza, so anyway, that's here's from Thomas Aquinas. He was not a rationalist. So that's all. And I do want to say, in terms of your limitations, I think the 3-part form made it hard for you to show your brilliance. Because I think all of these things are asking you to have down, and you really could go deeply into them. But I think that it was very clear to me that the demands of the journals was hard for you to show your stuff in.
Mm-hmm.
So thanks.
Great, thank you.
Congratulations.
Thank you, Don. Would you like to say anything else in response to the one? Okay, so first of all, I would like to, with my dissertation chair hat on, to say a few words and just to praise your writing. I think your writing is really clear and it's really good. And I also would like to, despite the limitations that both you and some of us as committee members have pointed out in terms of the work, the writing is fantastic, and the fact that you already got the 3 papers published or accepted for publication, I think is quite an achievement for someone at your trajectory in your moment, So I just wanted to read here, since I have a little time here, a couple of 3 lines from your editors I'm familiar with, your anonymous reviewers, some of the stuff you were also sharing with me as we were going along. And for example, the reviewer of the recently accepted paper from Journal of Humanistic Psychology, he or she wrote that this is the finest article I've had the privilege of reviewing since joining the Journal of Humanistic Psychology board. And the reviewer of the Journal of Transpersonal Psychology for the Inaction article said this is an exceptionally brilliant theoretical article, beautifully conceived, elegantly and parsimoniously presented, and gracefully written despite the complexity of the conceptual material. And the editor, the main editor of the Journal of Transpersonal Psychology, when she published your piece, in the editor piece, I will not read everything she wrote, but she said that drawing from multidisciplinary sources, he offers depth as well as breadth, illusion readers into deep discussion of the unfolding nature of human experience as both biological and spiritual beings. And then she emphasized, this article is one that would benefit from being studied, not just right. So I wanted to preface my also engagement with you with something words of praise for your writing and also your clarity exposing a lot of material in like 45, 50 minutes here today. So that's really great. So one of my questions, but you already answered that question, is how the three articles stick together, right? And this is the challenge in when you use three papers, multi-paper dissertation format, but in a way you already answered that at the very end, you know, with those connections. I think this is an area that I think would be, I know that you're going to be exploring in years to come, how all these kind of like intellectual developments, you know, like they come together into this more, what you call a non-reductive vision of human nature. So I think that's something I'm personally very looking forward to seeing your, you know, your even more mature work, you know, as you move along in your trajectory as a scholar. So I'm really looking forward to that. So please do continue and pursue those threads into this kind of vision. I think it will be really great, fantastic. And then the main area I want to engage you more critically, of course, is an ongoing conversation on essentialism. And this is something, you know, like in many ways, like the conversations that take place in a defense very often are, it's like kind of like a continuation of conversations we have had for years, sometimes in this case for 1 year at least, you know, with you. So in response to my comments, you know, you say that the justification to use kind of essentialist talk about, you know, like the essence of human sexuality, you know, on the one hand, is that otherwise, without such existential essentialism, and I'm quoting verbatim, we run the risk of getting lost in a relativistic world devoid of meaning and value. Yes, I think this is problematically. It's problematic philosophically. You know, it kind of falls prey to what Richard Bernstein called the Cartesian anxiety. You know, either we have like some kind of essential, absolute, Archimedean point, or you know, objectivist values, standards of value of meaning, or prey of this kind of like nihilistic, relativistic worldview. So I would like you to think and maybe qualify that in your final draft, because you know, the possibility of like human values and standards of knowledge emerging historically in the conversion of mankind, as Richard Rorty says, is like widely accepted today in philosophy. So that kind of justification is still problematic. And then you also, in answer to my question, you say, you ask yourself in the dissertation, who are we to proclaim the universal essence of anything, right? Who are we? And then you respond in pragmatic terms. You say, well, this is grounded this is grounded on our own experience, on our hand, but this also has been corroborated by the feedback of the students and clients with whom we have worked for many, many years, you know. I think you're also on shaky grounds here, because on the one hand, you are kind of like, you know, like making a proposal for an essential nature of sexuality that is essential, is basically universal, is pan-human, you know, for the human species. And on the other hand, you are saying that this is based on your experience, and also you work with probably a few hundreds of Western, modern, probably white individuals, you know. So you're still open to criticism, you know, from colonial criticism, you know, from ethnocentric claims and so forth, you know. So this is still a little shaky. You do say about the importance of cross-cultural research necessary, and I would like to emphasize that that's really, really important. But then there is another element, and this is the one I would like you maybe to respond, is I think that in that discussion, what I find missing is kind of like a critical awareness of the circularity between our understanding, a transformational practice, and the experience that it produces. You know, all transformational practices have embedded different understandings of what is human nature and that shapes the experience. And this is something that I don't find discussed here, and I think it should be discussed more explicitly. As you know, I'm very sympathetic personally to this idea, or this proposal of sexuality as life force, you know, and I've been in connection myself personally with this body of work, as you know. But still, I think that it's important to discuss. That's circularity, you know, so that you prevent yourself from the accusation that you have like this kind of key master practice that, unlike any other, like from Tantra to Taoist cultivation to Christian sexual practices, is the one that can allow us to see the essence of human sexuality, you know, because there are other sexual practices that tell us different things about human sexuality. Some of them similar, some of them different, you know. So, and then ultimately I would wonder is it fully consistent, the essentialist talk, with embracing an inactive paradigm, you know? Is there something that's maybe inconsistent, you know, if we really embrace this idea of cognition and world constitution also including our human nature as a transformational process, as an ongoing dynamic process, to what extent the essentialist talk is consistent? And also, as I asked you before, is what is to gain and what is to lose using that kind of essentialist talk, you know? So I'm still struggling with those claims, and I don't know if you have any response to these comments. Yes.
Yeah, well, I think those are all important things to make more explicit, you know, and really help contextualize the perspective, you know, particularly the relation between transformational practices and experience, also cultural context. But yeah, I don't know. It's tricky. It's tricky dealing with the paradox of how, as you know, how as subjective beings we arrive at objective truth. You know? How do we arrive at truth when we all have our own perspective? And I don't know. I feel like there's also maybe a different understanding of the term essential and how it's typically used potentially and how we're using it. And essential characteristic that we're uncovering, which is already grounded in a vision of life that is essentially dynamic. So it's not a static essentialism or a fixed essentialism, but it's a foundational element of experience that's linked to you know, a fullest flourishing of human potentials, a core, an inner guidance that is fundamentally dynamic and in relationship to the dynamic processes that each of us are living. So maybe the word essential is then misleading to some extent. And so for me the challenge is how do you say, like, we're trying to get to the essential experience of sexuality, which is from one perspective, and it's always dynamically situated, and we all have our own experience of what that essential quality is. We're not necessarily articulating the essential. We're using words to try to articulate something that is always vague and multifaceted, and we're trying to get as close as we can to what we feel is that essential experience, to invoke similar experiences in others or help other people connect to that deeply. So I think there's kind of the challenge of language and the challenge of how to bring those intuitions into form. Yes. And so I think, all those criticisms you arrived at, like, I've already taken those into account in my, implicit understanding of things, but it's important to make them explicit and important to make them, so you're not misunderstood as having this.
Could I just say a very short thing?
Yes.
I feel two words that I react to that tip the hand here are clean and healthy.
Yeah.
In terms
Another thing,
It's
moral.
tricky. It's like I'm thinking
words,
also in terms of what we can call scholarly, skillful means. I mean, because your message is so important, and I'm totally aligned with that. And I wonder aloud, like, what is this the best skillful way to go to be heard and not to awaken unnecessary resistance to the message, Because it is one thing to say, sexuality is a bridge to a creative power of life. It's one thing to say sexuality is connected to this source of creativity. Another thing is like creative life force is the essential nature of sexuality, right? maybe we should be asking many people from different cultures, modern, non-moderns, white, non-whites, what do you think about that before even start considering the question, right? So that's, I think it's a question for me more skillful means, more than that the underlying message and the underlying intention of your word that with which I feel completely aligned, actually. Yes. One more thing, and then I also want to say 2 words about method and hermeneutics in response to the other committee members. But my last question for you, and also for you to respond to the audience, because here you are with many doctoral students, some of which perhaps they may be considering using this multi-paper format. And my question for you is like, what have you learned? What have you learned from using this format? What have you learned from working with professional editors in journals? What are the challenges? What are your words of advice? Is this a format you now tell the students don't use it, or you will say yes, use it? Just anything from your own experience that you can say here in your defense to also the audience, and also to me, because I'm also interested about that question.
Yeah, well, I would say on the one hand, it really helps you focus your dissertation and get it done, because you have smaller objectives. You have an article, you have an article, you have an article. And in that way, it's like stepping stones towards the completion. And then also another positive is the feedback with the editors. So your capacity as a writer is really growing just in the first article, submitting it, receiving feedback, submitting it, receiving more feedback. It's kind of like your skills as a writer really helped me a lot, And then the next article, and then the next article. And so I get excited every time I get feedback now. Whereas when I first got my first feedback, I was like, oh, this is, it's hard to sometimes take in. I have my vision and now it's being demolished by this feedback. But now I just love feedback. It's like, give me feedback, and I'll incorporate it. And so it's really growing as a scholar and writer. And I feel like that's a real value of doing this mode of dissertation, whereas the traditional mode, you maybe spend all the time writing, and then you have your masterpiece, and then you get feedback for the first time, and then so there's more. It helps me really grow as a writer. The one drawback, that I felt, the limitation I already expressed, is particularly, resonant with what Don was saying. Like, there's so many things I want to qualify or go deeper into. Like, have this vision, and now it's kind of stuck in a little journal article, and it doesn't get to expand out. And also each journal has their own particular vision of transpersonal psychology or humanistic psychology, and so you have to kind of, tweak it a little to be like, this is a humanistic article, Whereas if you're writing a dissertation, it's just like, this is me, So, and then the other positive is getting articles published for getting teaching jobs, and it looks really good on your curriculum to have articles, and it feels good too. There's something satisfying. Although having done this dissertation process now, I brought articles for everyone if anyone wants to take any. But they're like they feel like the old draft, the first draft or something now. Because in my dissertation, after the feedback from these 3, I've been, editing them and refining them, and it's never ending, And I mean, that's also, there's value in that too, because otherwise you're like, here's my finished article, look how good that is. And how often are you forced to really take time and say, have someone say, you published that, and you said that, and it's there, it's published, and you're stuck with it now. There's no going back, so, I don't know, I would really recommend it to anyone looking to excel or to advance, in particular in the world of academia, for the curriculum, and also as a writer, just in general. It's a really valuable way. And if you like, small steps, because when I was first doing my dissertation, you can see how grand these articles are in themselves, and the dissertation was pretty grand. So this really helped me say, like, okay, step by step, let's go nice and slow, and be a little bit more practical and reasonable. And the reality is, I really feel these kind of like little buds or sprouts, and my vision's still very tender and kind of growing and kind of new and forming, and not extremely rooted or grounded. And on the other hand, rooted and grounded, I've spent at least the last 6 years working on them, and but it takes a long time, and so I feel the potential for carrying forward in the future. So.
Thank you. And also, like, I would like to add as something aware of all your process with papers at your church, for full transparency, but also for didactic purposes. One of the articles was first turned down in one journal, and then he had to resubmit that article to another journal, and it's fascinating. It was fascinating, I think, for Sam, and for myself, as chair, to see the contrast between the feedbacks from editors or anonymous reviews from different journals that belong to different cultures of inquiry. So this is something also for all of you, your work can be more easily situated in certain cultures of inquiry, and you need to be very mindful about where to send it. If you send some of these articles, our non-reductive vision of human nature, to a neuroscientific journal, they are going to say this is total bullshit, right? So there are just like in academia, it's extremely plurivocal place, and you need to be very mindful who are your interlocutors, especially if you take this option. So the last thing I will say before we move forward is that I just want to say as a disclosure that I hear Maxine and you don't comments on hermeneutics, especially Maxine, and I just wanted to say that I think I may be in part to blame a little about Samuel's use of the term hermeneutics. I teach a class on theoretical research here at CRF, and I make the case that in a narrow sense, hermeneutics is understood, as you are using the term, and exegesis or eisegesis, like interpretation of text, and there is like a particular method in religious studies, in other areas, literary theory and so forth. But in a broad sense, we use here hermeneutics as synonym of theoretical research, in the sense that we are not gathering data, either quantitative or qualitatively, but we're studying meanings and texts, and we're working with interpretations. So in that sense, comparative studies could see comparative hermeneutics, integrative studies in integrative hermeneutics, even feminist theory or critical theory can be seen as critical hermeneutics or feminist hermeneutics. So I think that his broad use of the term, I think, is in part emerging from contact with my own approach around that, But I agree that perhaps this should be clarified and qualified in the method section. Would you feel comfortable with Dan, Maxine and Don, if he makes that clarification?
Thanks.
Yes, I think that would be a good idea.
Wait. Okay, so before we take off to talk with Maxine outside the room, I'm wondering if there is anything else that you, Maxine, or you, Don, would like to say or ask the candidate?
I don't have anything else. I think it's been a very productive defense, and it's been very engaging, and I think we've all learned a little bit from it. I think it's been very, very good.
Yes.
Me too.
Yeah, I agree, and I was particularly appreciative of your receptivity to the critical viewpoints of all committee members, and at the same time there is an area that we'll take for further conversations about the whole, Maxine's point about phenomenology and the enactive paradigm, I can totally see her point when you see an active paradigm as it comes from cognitive sciences, But the enactive paradigm as it's expanded beyond the cognitive sciences, I think that there may be a bit more room for phenomenology but that's something for further conversations post-defense. So thank you so much. Don and I, Maxine, Don and I were gonna leave the room with a cell phone, or maybe we'll go to my room for conference call, and then in the meantime we'll leave the audience here that is, I'm sure, eager to also engage Samuel in some questions or appreciations, and then we'll come back to the room, and then we'll call you on conference call here for the final verdict.
Okay. Do you want me to hang up now and you'll call me back? Is
Yes.
that what you're saying?
Yes, thanks.
Okay. Thank you all very much.
Thank you. We'll be back with you in a minute.
Yeah, this is great.
Yeah.
Conference call in
Hold on, Don. It was
and the number.
So, anyone have any?
does the articles, I think it's good to know that you have to persevere, because I just saw Sam from the outside, you know, and it's kind of frustrating when they don't respond, or, you know, or they send back and say this is shit or whatever, you know, and so part of the article thing, but I think if you had to write a whole dissertation, you got to persevere too. It's a different kind of perseverance, but it's one where, you know, I don't think you should. It's kind of like Sam is being real positive about all the negative comments, but it's the same thing with those articles. When you submit them, you have to just kind of take the comments and rewrite it again or whatever, because you're probably not going to, everything's not going to go through every time. But that's part of the process. The other thing is that I was thinking what Don said about the clean and healthy, that Puritans might say that too, and also porn stars might say that it's pretty pure and healthy. So, you know, those are kind of, but I know what you mean by that.
Yeah, well, those terms have footnotes, you know.
Yeah, like, what is clean, what is healthy, and blah, 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 it goes on forever.
I know, every term you use, then you have to qualify and define it and use it. And you have to be careful about your terms. Yeah.
That's,
get in trouble.
that's a pain.
The problem we have with the sexuality article is because it usually, I mean, that whole vision has emerged from us just teaching courses, and you know, when you're speaking, it's very different than when you're writing and then you're having your concepts analyzed in a particular way. How do you defend this? How do you define that? And it just is never ending. So there's always more you can make explicit and more you can qualify. So yeah, that's the fun academic process. Charles.
Just want to say, having gone through the struggle myself with my own dissertation, which is now a fossil 4 years ago, like so ancient, but you know, I look at it now and I go, so you'll probably feel that way in a few years. You'll look at it like, my God, I can't believe I wrote this. But the challenge, it seems to, it's persistent for a lot of CIS students actually, is this issue of, which is like you're kind of hitting on the edge right here in this committee, the subjectivity. And like, how does a scholar, we're trained with the mental hat. We come in, you're doing the PhD, you're going through the threshold, the initiation into academia. And then how do you go from this, you know, these claims that, you know, even Jorge with, you know, the rich world, spiritual worlds enacted, and the vital, these big kind of concepts. How does someone who reads, who's trained in scholarly work in the normal way, how do we bring that which we experience them to where we are? Like when you write an article, when you write a book, you write a dissertation, because this is the dance we're playing. You know, I had that challenge with insider, outsider kind of views in spirituality, how someone who studies something, a spiritual tradition from the outside has a certain view, and then somebody who's actually inside, who sees all the things that are being enacted, has a different view. It's like, how do you sort of bridge that? What do you envision? This is kind of like freeform. You can just, how do you envision like us as writers to sort of bridge those worlds?
Well, it's really challenging, you know. I just say find the best places to submit your work to, you know. Like, I submitted to certain journals, like Jorge was saying, to certain places, and the feedback I would get is like, this is theoretically inadequate, and where's the post-colonial, da 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 da, and they're like, oh, and I'd submit it somewhere else, and they're like, this is brilliant, I love it. You know, so I don't know. I mean, on the one hand, finding places that are really aligned with a more expansive vision, because I feel like a simple reality is that to really bridge to wherever you want to bridge what I'm thinking about, this journal I did submit it to, you really have to just like denude your ideas of all life and, you know, make it really dry and really, you know, you only have one concept that you're able to use, and then you have to spend the whole article on that one concept justifying that, and then you can write another article on that. It's just like, I don't know, I just don't recommend bridging too much, you know. Anyway, there's more I could say on that, but that was the experience. So. Yeah, it's not easy. Michael.
Sam. Well, first I want to say personally, it's amazing to see you here. And be feels like the end, like the ending of a particular cycle, which I was very blessed to start with you.
That's right.
And I'm curious if Sam today could drop back into Sam of 6 years ago, magically appearing like in the canyon at Esalen after the first week. What would you have any advice for Sam of 6 years ago?
Yeah, that was Sam of 8 years
8
ago.
years.
9 years ago. Yeah.
I don't
Advice?
like it.
I don't know. I would just say follow your heart. I mean, Sam of that years ago was kind of a crazy guy, so. It was a very different Sam, So, yeah, I don't know. That's a good question. I don't know. I was drawn here just for my own passions and creative. And I remember even taking Jorge's theoretical research, when I was in the master's, and he was outlining how to submit your work to articles and what you need to do. And I raised my hand. I was like, "You're assuming that I have any interest in writing an article? Like, why would I ever do that? And I have no interest in reading journals, and they make me sick opening one." And I was kind of like, "Oh," and he was like, "Oh, well." Like, "Well, you're an academic scholar, and you got to embody your scholarly nature." And I'm like, "You're assuming I want to be a scholar. I'm here for transformation, for personal growth." Most of my papers in class were personal papers, experiential papers. And then it was only like at the end I started getting more conceptual and things. So yeah, I would just say trust in the journey. You never know where you're going to end up. I would say to that Sam, you don't know anything.
I'm so pleased to be here and to see you in this capacity, and I see you teaching, and I'm going to refer to your committee who's just arrived.
You could finish.
I think what I wanted to say is that having participated in some of the experiential work that you and Marina have offered, and now seeing some of that conceptualized in your articles, I'm wondering how that process of actually embodying your academic self transformed you and your teaching. Because I know that I've experienced real transformation as a result of these processes. And I'm especially interested in this whole thing about
Hello.
Hi, Machine. So we're here. There's a
life
question
force
going on, but
generating.
we'll make the announcement and then we'll allow Sam to respond. Unless you can respond this very briefly, because Maxine needs to go and
Yeah.
Sam is going to.
Yeah, I can just say briefly that, it's really, I had these experiences of by conceptually clarifying them, they only became richer. More, the distinctions, they become more alive than when I move into the experience. For me, when I articulate them conceptually, it's like diving more nuance, and then my experience becomes much richer in many ways.
I'm really happy to hear that, because so often in some of the alternative universities, like the pull to experience is at the expense of honoring conceptualization. And to make that point at the end of your defense, I think it's very important. Actually, the intellectual work can enrich and deepen your experiential, and it's like a circle. It's mutually enriching. So I really appreciate that. Maxine needs to go. Don is already leaving the room because he has another appointment. So we discuss and we all consensually agree. Of course, we are passing the dissertation. There will be some minor revisions to make, and I will be telling them. But I want just to congratulate you, Dr. Samuel Malkemus. Maxine, so thanks for being here. And want to say anything else before you go?
Well, thank you very much. It's been a very interesting and enlivening 2 hours. And a big round of congratulations to Samuel from me.
Thank you, Maxine. And thanks so much for your work on the dissertation and for being here with us today.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
So now you can congratulate a happy But before you do that, and you take out the champagne and the snacks, I want some here. Some too. So,